South Korea and Japan continue to accelerate efforts to mend ties and build future-oriented relations after Seoul announced a plan to compensate the victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. And the leaders of the two countries also pledged active diplomacy to redefine their relationship. To process what's been happening so far, we have our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young in the studio. Welcome, Sooyoung.
Hi, Dami. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Let's first take a look at the summit. What the summit means for bilateral ties, which broke down in 2019 when Tokyo initiated a trade war against Seoul when Japanese firms were ordered to compensate the victims that they subjected to forced labor.
Right, so first let's be clear, there are long-standing historical disputes between the two countries which have really been a matter of national pride and dignity for both countries, but especially for South Korea, which was a victim of Japan's brutal colonization in the early 20th century. There's also the issue of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of women and wrongful claims over South Korea's islet of Dokdo. Now, that's why the Yoon administration has made it very clear that the summit was not the solution, but a first step towards resolving differences.
There were chances in the former administration, the Moon administration, obviously, to meet with predecessors, Japanese leaders, but those meetings were done on the sideline of international summits, where the significance of this meeting is this was a standalone. So this was intended to be give time to the bilateral relationship to talk about a range of issues.
So the summit may not have produced a joint statement, but their meeting and the two-part dinner really rebuilt the bridge that was burnt during the previous Moon Jae-in and Shinzo Abe administrations.
So in terms of security and across the political spectrum, it's been very much welcomed here in Japan. And business, of course, has been very strongly supportive of improving relations. The Keidanren, the main Japanese major business lobby group, has sought to set up funds for joint visits between youth groups and other business associations, and they're very keen to restore the already improving trade ties between South Korea and Japan. We see that.
And there were also tangible outcomes from the summit as the two leaders look to strengthen their cooperation, right?
That's right. In order to pursue future-oriented relations, Japan stopped export restrictions on 3 key materials used to make tech components in South Korea, whilst Seoul dropped its complaint to the WTO over Japan's export measures. And they agreed to discuss reinstating each other as trusted trade partners on their respective whitelists. Now, the two sides also agreed to cooperate on advanced technologies and new industries, establish economic security talks, as well as promote business and civilian exchanges. Another key move was fully restoring the bilateral military intel sharing pact, considered vital in their joint efforts to deter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats.
So it's been clear Seoul and Tokyo have common challenges that need to be addressed. And Japan inviting South Korea to the G7 summit in Hiroshima this May. That's a pretty significant move as well.
Yeah, right, you are, Dami. Not just for South Korea and Japan's bilateral relations, but also for regional and global diplomacy as well. The two neighbours are advanced economies and liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, which is now, of course, considered as the centre stage of world politics, accounting for over 60% of the global population as well as gross domestic product. Now, Seoul and Tokyo's cooperation is vital to drive forward the kind of security and economic initiatives for the United States, as well as others engaging in the region, where China's geopolitical rise really challenges international norms, such as the freedom of navigation as well as the rule of law. Now, Washington in this regard has been particularly keen to get its closest allies to mend fences.
Other mutual allies like Australia and Canada would also have been happy to see this summit happen. So it's been the culmination of a lot of determined diplomatic effort, and all of it driven, of course, by the concerns over the threats from North Korea, which still keeps testing its missiles in an aggressive fashion, and of course the concerns over the rising geopolitical power of China, and concerns, of course, over Russia, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine last year. So it's been a historic week in Japan-Korean relations, and that's set to continue.
Still, Sooyoung, moving on from history is easier said than done, considering the domestic controversy here in South Korea.
That's right. The opposition party here, as well as some civic groups, they say that Seoul's compensation plan dishonors the victims' wishes and that Japan hasn't given a sufficient apology for its wartime atrocities. And well, that's been their reason for rejecting past agreements by Seoul and Tokyo, such as a settlement in 1965 and the 2015 deal for a 1 billion yen fund to irreversibly settle the comfort woman issue. Now, what President Yoon and his government want to do is, well, what they want is an acknowledgement of previous wrongdoings, of course, while accepting that times have changed and that the two neighbours now have more common interests and shared challenges that they need to collaborate on.
Still, there hasn't been enough to convince those critics who claim South Korea has given away too much while receiving so little in return.
That's right. The controversy certainly hasn't died down, especially as Japanese media reported that Prime Minister Kishida requested the implementation of the 2015 deal and asked for Fukushima seafood import restrictions to be removed. Now, the top office in Seoul says that Japanese media reports are inaccurate and that those issues were not discussed. But of course, that still leaves question marks over how these remaining diplomatic sticking points, such as Korea's islet of Dokdo, will be raised and resolved between the two neighbours. And well, experts say that when Kishida makes an anticipated visit to Seoul after the G7 summit in May, the Japanese PM then, he might bring more diplomatic gifts to the table, such as plans to get more Japanese firms to contribute to the voluntary fund that compensates their forced labour victims. But we're really going to have to wait and see. But in the meantime, though, to encourage more Japanese firms to step up, Dr. Eric Kim suggests using market mechanisms.
Of course, it should be a political logic and a diplomatic logic always, but the mechanism that private firms work is controlled by the market mechanism. So currently, ESG is the heart of the interests of the global investment group. I think that if we can put a measure of how Japanese firms are, clearing their history and apologizing and also compensating their wrong in an ESG measure, they will have more incentives to voluntarily contribute to the compensation fund, in my opinion.
But more than anything, though, it's not going to be money that really settles public sentiment here in South Korea. It's clear that President Yoon does realise this. His 23-minute speech at a cabinet meeting earlier this week. Now, that was an emphatic nod to remembering history, but also breaking free from the past for the future of the nation.
Right, we'll have to wait and see how these efforts to rebuild ties will actually materialize in the months to come.
Indeed.
All right, thank you, Sooyoung, so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Dami.